Hi everyone, welcome to our Nesta Talks to event with Iesha Small. My name's Jenny Gibson. I'm the mission director for the A Fairer Start mission at Nesta. And I'll give you a little bit of introduction before we get going. So research has shown us that the circumstances of a child's early life dictate their future outcomes, from health, career, through to life expectancy. And so we know that children born into disadvantage are at higher risk of poorer outcomes in all of these areas. We also know, though, that evidence-based early interventions in education and social care can change that trajectory of a young person's life. The Youth Endowment Fund focuses on finding and funding interventions that show promise in reducing youth violence and improving outcomes for young people. Building an evidence bank on the most effective ways to support children, the YEF evaluates ideas and scales at what works to take action to improve the system. So joining us today to discuss their work is Iesha Small, Head of Change for Education and Families. Really pleased to welcome you today, Iesha. Thank you. We're very excited to talk to you, particularly in the context of Nesta's A Fairer Start mission. We're aiming to close that gap between richer and poorer children in terms of education and outcomes. I'm really interested in what we can learn from you and your organisation. So just to kick us off, why are you so interested in closing the school readiness gap personally?
Yeah, so in terms of my personal background, I was born to like a working class family. My parents were very young when I was born. The schools in our area had pretty poor reputations. Now that area is kind of dominated by particular multi-academy trusts and so on, but at the time it was pretty bad, the schools. And so on paper, I really ought to be one of the statistics that we're talking about here. But quite a lot of luck and some very deliberate decisions by my family made sure that I wasn't. But it's something that stayed with me throughout my career when I think about like people that I grew up with or people that I know via my wider friendship and family like connections who didn't necessarily have the same luck and opportunity as I did, but were equally smart or possibly more so.
I think that's really important because sometimes I think the narrative around early background and the influence on outcomes is that this is almost an inevitability, but that's not the case. And you're sitting here proving it.
Yeah, I am, but I'm also really wary of that kind of narrative, like in terms of that's kind of the social mobility thing, isn't it? Like, the one, like two people plucked
The
out of their
exceptionalism
background.
sort of feels.
Yeah, and it's kind of, yes, I have worked hard, but there are other people who I know who are as clever as I am and just had different opportunities or different breaks in life. So there are, you know, 10 or 15, 20, 30, hundreds of me, and they didn't make it. So actually, there is an issue there that is wider than the individual. And this is my personal view. Obviously, I'm not representing YEF in this comment. Is that people don't exist in a vacuum. You can take them out of their communities and stuff like that, but people need community. They need a sense of belonging, and that's something I feel was kind of missing from the social mobility narrative that was quite popular when I first started in my career.
And how do you think we can re-inject that sense back into the narrative? What kinds of things can we do to shift it?
I was about to say something about the government, but I can't keep up because I don't know which one I'm talking about now.
A lot of changes.
But one of the recent governments in their like leveling up agenda, that was quite interesting. It spoke a lot about communities. I can't believe I'm like quoting the government on this, but I think there has been a recognition that communities are important, and it seems like an obvious thing. So if you want a person to thrive, they can't do it all on their own. I feel like the lockdown's also shown us that like, people being very isolated and missing connections of various types. So it's not quite an answer to your question, maybe more like a thought for people.
And so sort of taking your own experiences and that kind of drive to change this social inequality situation, how has this played out in your career so far?
Yeah, so initially I was going to be an engineer, and I was for a while, so it kind of doesn't entirely seem massively linked to what I do now. But I found out about a scheme called Teach First, which is fairly well established now. But when I did it, it was only in its second year, and no one really knew what it was about. And it sounded quite interesting. And I thought, yeah, why don't I do that for a couple of years? Because that was how Teach First was marketed back then. To do it for a couple of years and then do something else, it's different now. Because my family would have been horrified if I said I was going to be a teacher for a long time. They thought it was a bit of a waste of an education. If I'm going to be honest, they're like, "Oh, you're the first person to go to university, and you're going to go and be a teacher. Like, why are you going to do that?" but yeah, so they're very proud of me now. But so I did that, and Teach First is my interest in Teach First was really in working in the kind of communities that I'd grown up in, basically. And at that time, I felt like, because it had been for me, education was kind of the answer in a way. You become educated, and then you have more options. That was my general thought. So I was a teacher, and then I ended up staying for quite some time. I think I ended up teaching for maybe 14 years overall. And I don't know how you found it, Jenny, but you get frustrated in different roles. So you do it, and then you kind of think, oh, I could maybe have a bit more impact if I did this role. Maybe I could have a bit more impact if I did this role. So that happened with me in teaching, and I became an assistant head. And then I realised I didn't fancy being a head teacher for a variety of reasons. I think it's an excellent role. I think people do a fantastic job. I think it's not for me. I think I know a few too many head teachers who had heart attacks for it to be something that I would want to do for myself. And then I became increasingly interested in educational policy because I wanted to look at like system change. So I went to work for an educational think tank, and then via a few twists and turns, I ended up doing what I do now, which is looking at we're helping change to happen in the sectors that I'm responsible at for YEF, which is education and kind of families and social care, and looking at what is the most effective way that change can happen, and kind of being externally facing to hear what is happening in the sectors, and then what are also looking at what we found is the most promising things to impact young people affected by violence.
And do you still see a continuity with that early sort of teaching experience? Does that still inform the way you approach work at YEF?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it does, because I feel like if you've worked with young people for a long time in any capacity, that never really leaves you. Because of the kind of schools that I taught in, unfortunately, I did know a number of, it's not the majority by any means, but I knew enough, and people that I had taught and cared about, and so on, who were impacted by violence in quite significant ways. So, I know a couple of young people who lost their lives, and that kind of thing. And going back to, the wider narrative versus what you actually experience as a person when you're in that situation yourself, there is a particular narrative around young people who are victims. I do use that word importantly, like victims of violence, because sadly the people who perpetrate violence are also often victims themselves. So some of the young people would be the headline because of whatever it is that happened, like maybe there was knife crime involved or whatever. But I can also think about the number of times they would have been sitting in my maths lesson, super engaged, really interested, and just being a normal, however old, 12-year-old, 13-year-old, 14-year-old. So yeah, I do think it affects my career, but also you want to do the thing that works. So in the classroom, the reason why I got interested in evidence and policy is because I tried things, and then sometimes it didn't work, and then you try and find out other ways to work out, what's the thing that's going to work best for my class, and then that just scales. And you do it based on experience, and then you do it based on what other people who are more experienced do, and then I was just always trying to find like the most effective way and most efficient way to do things, which led me to look at more like what does evidence say about things. Possibly because I'm a bit of a geeky person, so that's why I looked at it like that. But yeah, you want to have like I wanted to have the most reproducible way of doing things that didn't just work for me because I was a particular kind of teacher. Like, could it also work for my team of people that I managed? Could it also work for the areas of the school that I was responsible for? Could it work, when I worked at a think tank? could this be something that would work at scale across, say, London if we're working with the GLA? Is it something that could work nationally if policymakers are saying what do we need to inform ministers or so on and so forth? So you want it to be reproducible, scalable, and effective, which I think is a very clear link to what I'm ended up doing, what I'm currently doing.
I actually see links there to engineering as well, that kind of systems level thinking, and thinking about service design as well as individual level interactions seems quite lots of engineering approaches take that kind of way of thinking.
Yeah, it's weird. I was talking to someone yesterday that I'm working with on a project, and they were like, "Oh, you used to be an engineer. How's that got to do with change?" And because people often ask me that, like I've thought about it more than I might otherwise have done. And I think you're right. There are definitely some links. Like I was, an engineering approach to things as opposed to a mathematician's approach is slightly different. Like we're probably a bit more free and easy engineers, but it's more pragmatic. Exactly, slightly more pragmatic about things. So it's like you do your best guess estimate based on some clear principles, but then you want to get to testing it once you've done that, and then it's very much an iterative approach to things, which I see in my general approach to life, but also some of what we've got to do at YEF as well. It's kind of, okay, what are the clear principles? What are the best bets of working? How can we communicate that? Yeah, that's the other thing. Like, if you're a math teacher who's even half decent, you have to communicate what other people can find to be quite complex ideas. And you have to remember that other people find that quite complex and hard in a way that they understand. And if not, it doesn't mean that they're stupid. It's more that you're not very good at explaining it. So you have to look at it again.
Missing in the middle there.
Yeah, exactly. So then it's kind of the same thing. Some of the things that we're looking at YEF or that I've come across in my career are complicated and not easy problems. So it's, if I'm good at my job, then I need to learn to explain them in a way that makes sense to. I always test it like, can I explain it in a couple of sentences to my 9-year-olds? And if they can explain it, if they can understand it, then that's okay. And if not, then I need to refine that explanation.
I love that as a rule of thumb. That's great. Shall we move on to talking about potential connections between the work that YEF are doing and our A Fairer Start mission at Nesta? I'd love to hear your thoughts on where those overlaps might lie, and maybe where some of the differences are too.
Yeah, so I'll say this based on what I understand for Nesta, but if I'm making a mistake, do correct me, Jenny.
Of course.
So as I understand it, Fairer Start is really looking at children born disadvantaged, so links to what we were talking about earlier, also linked to some of the work that YEF are doing. And the travesty, basically the kind of outrage that we should be feeling over the fact that they experience poorer health, lower earnings, shorter life expectancy, and lower levels of happiness than their more, their peers who are born into luckier, more affluent situations. And you're trying to narrow the gap. So looking at it in early years, which is not YEF's area of expertise, I think maybe like the early intervention foundation, the kind of more that, like one of our kind of sister what work centres. But you also look at it in secondary, which is part of YEF's remit. So generally speaking, we a cohort of young people we're looking at is 10 to 14, but there is an overlap in terms of, generally speaking, the young people who are more at risk of youth violence are also people born into disadvantaged circumstances in life. So I feel like there is kind of a like a synergy. I hate that word. That there's a connection there. So I was thinking when we were talking about prepping for the event, the areas that there are quite a number of areas that are probably relevant, but the two in terms of our funding areas. So I should say that in terms of what YEF does is there are kind of 3 areas of activity. So one is that we're a funder. We fund promising programs and so on to add to the evidence base. We want to find out what works via looking at evidence, and we've got a kind of a research function. And then we also are looking to kind of create change and understand what young people think. So they're kind of our 3 areas of operation. So in terms of our themed funding rounds, which is the areas that I've had the most to do with, we recently had a families funding round, which is called a supportive home, which is like co-founded with Comic Relief, and that was really looking at kind of like, we know that kids who live in homes where there are challenges like conflict, domestic abuse, alcohol, substance misuse are more likely to become involved in violence. There's like a clear overlap, I think, with some of the young people that you're looking at. And then we are looking to fund programs that the evidence suggests could have a positive impact on violence, or what we want to find out more. And then the other area, which is possibly more directly related for this audience, is we've just closed the funding round that we're co-funding with EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation. I always get confused if it's a foundation or a fund. And that is specifically, it's called a safe, positive place to learn, but it's specifically looking at what approaches might improve attendance and reduce exclusions, which is very much of an overlap with some of the stuff that you're looking at.
I think so. One of the things we're trying to think about in our mission is thinking about development over time for children and young people. We have got this early years focus, and lots of organisations do. But of course, children don't just fall off a cliff when they're 5. They go into school, they go into kind of youth programs, and I think it's really important that we see that holistic trajectory for children and young people, so that we're supporting in different ways that can adapt over time. But we're not just thinking one single intervention at a single time point is going to be the quick fix for something.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't mention it before when we spoke about stuff that's affected me in my career that's relevant to this, but hearing you mention that made me think about, if you're in a secondary school setting, you can often think, that's it, that's the world, right? And then maybe occasionally you might give a bit of nod to primary school if you happen to teach a year 7 class, because it's like, the transition was a bit like, why don't they know this kind of thing, which now I know is a super simplistic way of looking at things, and primary school teachers do a fantastic job. But I was a governor at a children's centre for a while, which was kind of my first real interaction with the early years setting. I didn't know a great deal about it, but before that, and it made me realise, like, first of all, what excellent work they do in early years, like how complicated and skilled the work is, and the workforce is not paid very well for a start, but what a difference it can make later, and the impact on the stuff that people in secondary schools do much later. So one of the things was, we had a speech and language therapist that we got funding for, and it makes such a massive difference. The evidence supports this as well. It's out of YES remit, but kind of in terms of the importance of speech, language, and communication as early as possible, and the exposure to good role models and so on in that, and how it can impact schooling. So it seems like an obvious thing to say now, and for anybody who knows early years well, it seems super obvious, but not everybody does know early years well, or have much to do with it and understand what they do. But that really opened my eyes to it. Just as early as possible, you can get children and their families any support that they need. You probably save quite a bit later down the line, but it's hard sometimes to have funding for things that are not like at the acute end of things, because it's hard to prove what that impact has been, because you'd have to do some kind of longitudinal study, right?
That's right, yeah, and that's interesting. So in my sort of other job, I've got a research hat, and I've been looking at kind of longer term outcomes for early speech, language, and communication needs on mental health, and seeing sort of variance in outcomes, and particularly social and emotional sort of anxiety disorders, depression, but also conduct problems and behavioural problems really being explained by those early communication skills. Because we've got these resources of sort of fantastic cohort data sets, we can see those relations. But when it comes to actually testing interventions, then it's so much harder, because the implementation that's involved is really challenging, and then sort of following children up at that level of detail is also really complex. So I think we definitely need more intervention research to be resourced, so we can start to evidence some of these things.
Also, like, with your other research hat on, is how do you prove what it is that actually had the impact, right? There are so many things that could have affected that child or young person. So yeah, they had that intervention. It's actually really hard to well, going back to what we talked about in terms of community and all these other things that are affecting them at a particular time. Yeah, I can see why sometimes this area is particularly fraught.
Yeah, and I think, there are sort of technical solutions like doing more sort of complex modeling and so on, and trying to account for different factors, or maybe doing simulation-based approaches. But I'm also a real fan of qualitative research as well, that really brings in the perspectives of people and communities who've experienced interventions or have experienced, particular social issues to give their opinions about what's working, what's not, and what's missing in terms of service provision.
Yeah, I think so. With my previous hat on, in terms of the think tank that I used to work at, like, one of the things that was really important to us was like qualitative research. One of the things that's often leveled at organizations like YEF as a what work center is that we're, a little bit too cold. It's a bit too much RCT every day, all this kind of thing. But actually, like a big section of some of our work is we really want to understand what it is that young people think about things. So one area that I think is super interesting, just from a personal perspective, and linked to what you said, is the work of our kind of like my colleagues in youth understanding. So there's a project that we've got called the Peer Action Collective, and that's like a massive kind of England and Wales wide project where many young people are involved in, I guess, what people would maybe call action research, looking at topics that are important to them, that they think impact them and their communities, or related to youth violence. And that's, it's a different kind of evidence. It's not the same as an RCT or, a QED, for example. Sorry, I should say randomized control trial. I shouldn't use jargon. But it's still valid, and it's still important and interesting, and there's things that we can learn from it.
Can you tell me a bit more about that? What's the sort of mechanism for your peer action collective? How are you soliciting those views, and how do young people contribute?
Yeah, good point. So I'm going to give an overview of it. I'm not the person kind of working on it, but and we have a delivery partner to help us out with it. But basically, the peer action collective, they've been recruited across the country along with our delivery partner, and they are working in different communities. So they're within their own communities, and then they've been working to kind of come up with a research question, kind of recruit other young people who are going to be helping them to answer that, and then work to solve it, basically. So they looked, recently we had a kind of a team day where some of the people who've been working on it in the area that we were in came to talk to us about it, and they had looked at education, housing, because they thought that was something really important, and that had a bearing on outcomes related to youth violence. Because, like, if young people are in their contention was that if young people are in overcrowded housing, or unsafe housing, or whatever, they don't want to spend time there, so they're out and about on the streets more, and they're more likely to become involved in dangerous activities, or to be exploited, which could lead to them being dangerous activities. So yeah, education, housing. What was the other one? There was a specific one because of the area that those young people were from, that was looking at kind of the impact on communities for young people from refugee communities, and how they experience things, and the kind of exclusion and alienation that they felt, and what they thought were solutions. So yeah, like, they kind of set the tone for what it is, and come up with some things to make us think about some of the work that we're doing, and to challenge us. Just very interesting.
I think that's so important, and something that we can definitely learn from in our Affair Start mission. I'd like to be doing more work where we can bring in those young people's perspectives and different challenges with a different age group. But we'll have to talk at some point about the practicalities. If you can connect me with your team, that would be great.
Yeah, very much so. And kind of ahead of this, I did look at some stuff that was relevant to the stuff that you're interested in, and their particular thoughts was specifically around. So for exclusion, some of the things that they had to say about it were: is exclusion always the appropriate response for all types of behavioural issues? So they accepted that sometimes it was necessary, but they also thought that it maybe wasn't fair or proportional in response to maybe like punishments for poor attendance, where actually there's some other reason underlying, possibly illness or something else going on. So in some cases, exclusion could make that worse. And then the other one, which I think is an ongoing issue for anybody who works in education or with young people or kind of for young people, is they also highlighted the kind of sometimes lack of appropriate support for students with special educational needs, and how that lack of understanding around that can then lead to young people being treated in a particular way or responding in a particular way, which isn't great, but also could possibly be dealt in a way that wouldn't escalate in the way that it did with more neurotypical young people.
Yeah, I think actually that makes me think of my sort of next question that I wanted to ask you about, which is the focus on academic outcomes. So quite often in society in general, we're very focused on closing the disadvantage gap in academic outcomes, so GCSE results or Key Stage 1 results.
Yeah.
Do you think this single-minded focus on academic outcomes is too narrow and could potentially have a negative impact?
Yeah, so this is something that I've maybe changed my mind on. Yeah, because if you think about what we were talking about earlier, my own route to where I'm at now is really via academics. Like, I'm quite an academic person. I did well at school, etc., etc. And so, and definitely when I was working in schools, the narrative is about the best thing, because schools are there to help people to learn, right? So there's a load of things you can say that schools do, and there are lots of things that teachers do, but ultimately they're there to teach. So, and you could argue that one of the best things you could do is to help people from disadvantaged backgrounds achieve, because then they'll be on a more level playing field with other peers. And I think I still believe that. Like, you can't say, oh, we're doing a great job and everything, and that your kids are leaving with no GCSEs. Like, that's not it, because that's not helping them in any way. But as I thought about it more and as I've experienced more, this is a personal view, I noticed that sometimes the focus on academics could mean that disadvantaged young people are missing out on some of the other things that make life worthwhile. And that's all great to have wonderful academics, but what does that do for their mental health? What does it do? What lessons are we teaching all types of young people about what makes them a worthwhile member of society? Like, are you only worthwhile if you've achieved things? Can you achieve things? You ought to be able to achieve things and also have a rounded life. So one thing in particular, there was some research that came out a couple of years ago where I noticed that like school break times had reduced since the 1990s. And it's, generally speaking, for older children or pupils and for poorer pupils. So in schools with and if I think about my experience when I was teaching, where were the intervention classes? They were taken out of the kind of soft lessons, right? So you'd get extra English and maths. Where did it come from? It would come from, I don't know, PE or
Music.
drama or music. And it's kind of, on the one hand, okay, but on the other hand, maybe that's like the one lesson that this particular child actually achieves in and enjoys, and then suddenly you're hammering them with English and maths. Like, I say that as someone who's a maths teacher who thinks maths is super important. So, that's a very long answer to we shouldn't be, in trying to solve one problem, we shouldn't be creating disadvantage and a gap in another, because I can guarantee you that more affluent pupils are not losing out on their music lessons or their sports lessons. They absolutely are not. So, yeah.
I always think it's a bit of a false dichotomy as well. So some of the research evidence that we've been looking at is showing that academic outcomes can be predicted from both kind of softer social skills, broader cultural experiences, playful experiences, as well as early literacy and vocabulary and things like that. So both factors, broadly constructed, are explaining academic outcomes, and therefore you don't need to have this debate, should it be English or music? Actually, both are supporting children on that learning journey.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if I put on my like former school leader hat on, then it's kind of there's a fixed amount of time in the day where you're going to get it
Yeah.
from, and we need to, it could equally be argued that the inspection incentives or pressures have caused schools to have to behave in a particular way, and maybe bodies like Ofsted haven't thought about the unintended consequences of things. Like, I can see all the arguments for it, but I think it's a debate still worth having. And yeah, it's funny you mentioned play. Like, on a personal note, like, I'm becoming increasingly obsessed with play and the value of it. Not in a everyone's got to do play therapy kind of way, but no disrespect to anybody who's into that, but more the link between play and creativity, and how that's also, all that stuff. As you said, you can't divorce it from overall achievement. In life, people need to have a degree of creativity and not always just be following the prescribed way of doing things if they actually want to be successful in the way that society defines success, which is another matter to discuss.
I mean, it'd be great to get some questions from our audience. If you have particular questions that you'd like to ask Iesha, drop them in the chat and we can pick them up. I'm interested in the kinds of evidence that might help improve childhood outcomes, particularly in relation to youth violence, which is the YEF specialism.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit more about that, and if any of those that you know of involve kind of creative aspects as well?
Yeah, so the kind of thing that I'd like to refer people to here is our kind of our toolkit. So YF has a toolkit which has got loads of interesting information about. We're looking. I should highlight that we're looking at it from a youth violence lens. So there are things that might be effective trying to do something else, but we're looking at it ultimately, does it improve outcomes in terms of youth violence? But yeah, my excellent colleagues over in the toolkit team have been doing a lot of work on it, and some things that I think might be relevant to this audience are kind of social skills training, for example. Like, we've been talking about kind of the wider aspect of children's lives. So social skills training, when you pop over to the toolkit, it's basically got like a highlight card so you can kind of see the headlines of it, but you need to delve into it to kind of see the nuance of things. We feel that the evidence suggests that there's a potentially quite high impact on violent crime, and the evidence is fairly strong for it. So it's a decent quality of evidence and decent range of evidence. And this kind of thing, like, what is it? It's training to support like young people and children to think before they act, which, if we think about kind of some of the more impulsive young people get into trouble, that's actually really, really important. And to use strategies for managing their impulsiveness and aggression. So currently, the research suggests that children who develop these social skills and self-control are much less likely to be involved in crime and violence. And if I transfer it to a school setting, that's going to mean that they're less likely to kind of get in trouble for certain types of behavior as well, going back to our kind of exclusion point and so on. So yeah, that's one of the things. And what I often find that people find helpful is when is the kind of intervention effective, and like, what is it that helps it to be useful? So in this case, the impact depends on the type of program, but generally speaking, in terms of implementing it well, it's suggesting that finding the time in a busy curriculum is sometimes an issue. So I guess it's prioritizing it if it's relevant for the cohort of young people that you're talking about. it's possible that some settings might find that easier. So maybe like a PRU might find that more useful, but it's also absolutely important in mainstream. And then the kind of adaptability and accessibility of teaching materials was also something that we found was very useful here. So I think that's a lesson for anybody who might be listening who's like designs interventions for schools to use. It's kind of, you think about, if you're getting teachers to use it, teachers actually are there to do some other thing, like teach their subject or whatever it is. So they need to be super clear materials that are very easy to adapt to their context and make sense and can be used. And also, like an ongoing theme that we hear is, how do things adapt to local culture? So some of the evidence that we sometimes look at is US based, and there are some things that translate very well, and there are other things that actually don't quite work in a UK sense, which is why sometimes we fund things where the evidence looks like it's probably quite good, but it needs to be adapted to a UK setting to see how that works. So that's kind of one of the things. And then the other one, just because it can be quite a popular one depending on the kind of school, is sports programs. So I thought I'd have a look at that. Like, when I taught in a school in Islington, and I taught in a school in Haringey, and because they were very close to like well-known Premiership teams, so one of them was close to Arsenal, and the other one was close to Tottenham, and like a lot of these big teams have outreach facilities and to help young people who are not doing well in school. So again, this is one of the ones where the impact is supposed to be is expected to be quite high. The evidence though is like a bit shaky on it. So it's the kind of thing that we'll be looking at in a bit more detail. So yeah, but it's one that is often very popular with young people and parents, because it taps into some of their own interests, which is always important. But the ways to make it effective are to develop strong trusting relationships with the children, which I guess you could say is one of the ways to make everything effective. Again, choose an accessible start time and location. Like if they've got to travel somewhere super far, and particularly for the kind of young people we're talking about, as adults we take this for granted, but for young people who are at risk of violence, a couple of roads down away from your school or setting actually might be very dangerous because it's suddenly a different postcode. Whereas we don't notice that as people not affected by it, but for them that could be super important. And then kind of using that activity as a hook to other things that can help with their development as well, and just being aware of the reasons that they may leave it or might not have continued engagement that may need nothing at all to do with the actual sessions themselves and could be to do with their wider lives or things that might be happening, like maybe they have to go off and collect a younger sibling, for example, because their parents are at work or unable to look after them or that kind of thing. So yeah, just an awareness of wider issues.
That's really helpful. And thinking about those wider issues, a lot of young people who are affected by violence or the threat of violence might be experiencing fear in their daily lives. How do you think that impacts on their education?
Yeah, okay, so this is an interesting one. You recently released a report called, I'm just trying to remember what we called it now because it was called a few different names, but officially now it's called the Children Crime and Vulnerability Report. And that, we did a survey with a number of young people and some other bits and pieces, but 65% of young people, teenagers, said that they changed their behaviour to keep themselves safe from violence in the past 12 months. 65% of people that we surveyed, I should say. And the kind of bit that's super relevant to schools and education settings is that 14% had been absent from school out of fear, and a 14%.
14%?
Yeah, like so,
Wow.
a reasonable number of the people that we surveyed. And a further 14% said that it caused them to lose concentration because they are worrying, which, if you think about it, is not completely out there. If you're worried about the fact that you might get beaten up or something or other on the way home, you might not be concentrating on how to balance equations, perhaps. So when I saw that, it made me think about kind of links to contextual safeguarding, and kind of particularly in the context of, so what I should say is contextual safeguarding is really about recognizing that that as young people grow up, they're influenced by a whole range of environments and people who are beyond their family, and some of the things related to that could be buildings, like school buildings, and that's something that I'm a bit obsessed with design. But if you, it happens a bit less now because of the investment in school buildings. But if you go to some of the older schools, like the kind of 1960s type schools, I remember kind of visiting one, and there's lots of kind of crannies and places for like little nooks for people to hide or be hidden in, or people to jump out from, which could be the kind of thing that makes young people feel scared. And I remember when we used to kind of do, break time patrols and stuff like that, there were particular areas that we'd always make sure that we went to, because that's somewhere that you generally couldn't be seen by adults, and where stuff might be more likely to happen. So yeah.
That's really interesting because it has sort of investment implications as well, for the resourcing of designing our spaces with children and young people in mind. And I think quite often, we think about designing spaces for cars or other sort of things rather than our children and young people. That's a really interesting challenge.
Yeah, and it's I remember when I was maybe like a teenager, I think, there was a young boy called Damilo Taylor who was murdered. And I knew that estate that he'd been attacked in. And there were loads of places where, you know, something could happen to you and you weren't, nobody will see. So it's got massive implications for school buildings, but also housing and all sorts of things. If you drive around or walk around more affluent areas, there's a lot more open space.
Yeah.
If you think about your sight lines and all that kind of thing, you can see a lot more. That's not the case in other types of areas. I'm thinking more in an urban environment. Obviously, in a rural setting, it's different. But yeah, all these kind of things that we don't necessarily think about, but can have an implication for people's safety and lives.
Would you be happy if we move on to taking some questions from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try. Let's go.
Okay, let's have a look what's in the chat.
Okay.
Interesting question here from Carla. How does young people's mental health factor into the youth violence lens of your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are specifically looking at some therapeutic interventions actually. So I didn't go into the kinds of things we were looking at for the families round, but the stuff that we were interested in were family therapy interventions, parenting programs, and domestic abuse, and then parental conflict. But the family therapy interventions was something that would speak to that. And then we've got a later funding round that's coming up, which is specifically looking at, I think it's multi-systemic therapy, but please don't attack me if I got that wrong. But then we definitely know that it's important, and we'll be looking more of it in terms of our themed funding round.
And when you fund interventions, is this, are you open to any sort of service that might support children and young people or families and young people, whether that's coming through the NHS or third sector providers? Are you sort of open to interventions that come from any of those sources?
Yeah, so generally for each round, there's a set of criteria that programs have to meet, but the kind of referral pathway generally is fine as long as usually the common things that they have to be working with some kind of statutory organization in some manner or have links to it, and that's really about that they are able to reach the number of young people that would be interested in, and that they have clear referral pathways. So it's usually around that. But in terms of, yeah, it could be via a local authority, it could be individual charities, etc., etc. There is one thing that I feel like I should mention, because it's something that I feel quite strongly about, but also as an organisation we feel strongly about. There is a disproportionality in terms of funding, in terms of the types of charities that tend to be funded. So because of our focus on a particular level of evidence and often size, it has implications for the size of the organisations that we can fund, and across kind of funding activity in general, not just for us, kind of organisations that are like smaller community organizations and also ones led by like Black, Asian, and ethnic minority groups tend to not meet that criteria, so they're disproportionately not funded, which is absolutely not great. So we recognize that and we're working on a particular fund that will specifically be aimed at those types of organizations, because we know that in our normal funding round sometimes they will miss out, but we also have like go through quite rigorous we work with another organization to challenge us on that, to make sure that our funding rounds are fairer in terms of their funding, and that's something that's kind of runs throughout a lot of our work.
That's good to know about. And I think you make such a good point there, because if you're looking at a certain size of organization, it probably is from more privileged groups that haven't had sort of centuries to build up an endowment or a donor base or those sorts of things. So that's really good to be able to be a bit more flexible on that.
Yeah, and also usually they need to have reached a particular I won't kind of go into all the technical bits and pieces, and I also might butcher it a bit because I'm not from the evaluation side, but there's a certain level that the program itself needs to be at, just so that it can then be scaled and evaluated in the way that we would evaluate things. So we always refer people to the Early Intervention Foundation's 10 steps to evaluation, and we're usually on like, we'll keep that kind of like step 2 or 3. But we appreciate that, you know, if somebody's really passionate about something and they're doing this in their spare time after their work, they may not have had the resources to get themselves together to be up to that. They're just trying to meet a need in their local community. So we do have our themed funding rounds might not be the place for that, but we do have other ways of looking at that and trying to deal with it. And we do have a section of our work that is about capacity building for those kind of promising organizations. But yeah, it's a definite issue just across funding in general.
I agree. And it's great to know that you're actively doing something about that problem. Just picking up other comments in the chat. Let's see what we've got. Rose is asking that I'm curious about how you support teachers to support the young people. Is it one-to-ones? Is it groups? Maybe it's professional development. How do you, or is there a range of these sort of things that you support?
Yeah, okay, great question, Rose. So obviously the EEF is kind of one of our sister what work centres, and they are more focused at schools specifically, and they have stuff like their kind of like evidence champions, don't they, and their research schools. We don't currently work directly with schools ourselves, so the mechanism at present is that we are funding. So for the funding round that just closed, which was the schools-based one, we were looking for organisations that have that are doing what we think is interesting and can build on the evidence base in particular areas. So anti-bullying, classroom behaviour management, internal alternative provision, needs-led interventions, parent communication interventions, targeted family engagement, and social and emotional learning. So what we were looking at is organisations who run those kind of programs. And so to directly answer Rose's question, they might do any number of those things that she said. And we don't have a particular view about what it needs to be. It just needs to be something that fits with what we have found so far could be promising or effective for the groups that we're interested in. The actual methodology of it is for the organisations to show us and to work out in co-design.
That's really interesting. And do you support a wide range of topics as well? So there's a comment in the chat about the role of financial education, sort of violence reduction, or sort of supporting educational outcomes. Are you sort of agnostic about what the focus is, or do you have a sort of set of guidelines that you work within?
We're agnostic about it as long as it's within the things that we as long as it's not the thing that we think definitely doesn't work. So I should put that into
theory of change to you rather than you having a sort of preconceived theory of change that they try.
Oh yeah, exactly. So as an organisation, I'd say, and that's the good thing about being a What Works Centre. Say if you're a different kind of foundation, you've been set up as a charitable foundation, then generally you're coloured by, say it's like a family fund or whatever. It's by the views of that family or person or whatever it is. And we don't really have that. It's more along the lines of it needs to it needs to be clear that it works. We need to be able to prove that it works, or at least show that it's in the ballpark of something that could work. And it needs to be something that eventually it needs to be something that will impact youth violence, or look at some of our primary outcomes. And we are interested in wider change, so something that could potentially scale. I'm probably not phrasing it in quite the right way, but we don't have it has to be this thing.
Yeah.
There are some things where we're very clear it can't, it needs not to be that thing. So one thing I would say is boot camps. That's something that we categorically will not support because the evidence suggests that they don't work.
Harmful in some cases.
Yeah, and can be harmful. So if it's something that we're very clear is harmful, then it's like, no, we won't do that. But other things, if there are things that are in the area of, yeah, this actually might be quite interesting, or, you know, this is something that a lot of people do and we should find out more about how useful it is, that could be another area. Then yeah, we're not, the method itself is not the thing, it's the outcome and the fact that it works and can be proven to work repeatedly.
So, on that note, I think we've got a great question, which we might have as our final question, and it's a question about scaling. You know, and so Nyla in the chat says, what do you do once you find out a project works? How do you scale it up? And do you pass that on to someone else, or do you support that scaling initiative?
Yeah, great question. I will answer as much as I can answer because some of it I don't know the answer to.
Yeah.
But if it works, then it's something that we want to share more information about. So that's the first thing. And the mechanisms for us could be regranting, although we don't regrant everything. It could be some kind of, you know, so we'll do evaluation reports, so that's the most obvious thing. But in terms of our mechanisms for change, what will start to come out, because we're newish in the kind of this sector, so maybe 2 or 3 years. But what will start to come after is what we're calling guidance reports. So the guidance reports for particular areas that we're working on will be recommendations for what we found works in that. So it's less the particular project, although of course there will be evaluation reports related to that. It's more the approach, and then what we are collectively learning from all the projects, and then also all the available high quality evidence. And we aim to kind of collate that in an easy form for people to be able to see, okay, yeah, this is what the evidence is saying. The most obvious way is that we update our toolkit, and then that talks about what it is that we found is working in this area. So that's probably the most obvious thing that people should go to. And then kind of, I guess, events like this. So as more things come out, you know, people like me who are more externally facing in the organization will talk about that externally. And we also, another area of our work is working with policymakers. So talking to them about what it is that we found. We have quite good links with the Department for Education, for example. So if there's policies that come out that the evidence suggests don't work, then we would obviously talk to them about that. But more usually what would happen is they'd be like, okay, what's the evidence saying about this? We're thinking about X, Y, Z, and then we'd come up with that. So there are a variety of ways of trying to make change happen based on when we find something that works.
And do you factor economic analyses into that? So if, you know, a politician says your program looks great, how much is it going to cost me? Do you have an answer ready to go, or is that something that you hope to build in at a future date, or think it's something that someone else will pick up?
Yeah, so my quick answer is on the toolkit there is a relative cost. So it doesn't go into the actual cost because obviously there are a number of factors that could affect it. But there is a kind of, say if you're choosing between bullying, anti-bullying programs and some other kind of thing, and say the two things you're looking at have a similar level of impact, similar level of like robustness of evidence, and you're thinking, okay, well, which one's the one that's probably going to be cheaper? There's a relative scale, so you could look at it for that. But to your question, the specifics of it, in the example that you gave us in terms of politicians or like a government department, we probably would help them to have an estimate, I'd imagine. But if it's kind of wider, that's not something that we generally would do, but we can give rough estimates of relative costs. But I don't want to say too much more about that because that's not my area of expertise.
No problem. Iesha, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today. I've really enjoyed our chats. Despite my sniffles, sorry about that. And really, thanks a lot to the audience as well. There's been some great engagement and comments here. I think we have got a mailing list at Nesta that you can find on our website if you want to join up and find out about more events. But for now, we'll say goodbye and thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And if anything you want to find out about, it should be just type in Youth Endowment Fund on Google, and all the stuff that I mentioned, some of the stuff that I mentioned, why yes specific, should be there.
That's great. Thanks so much.